So you think you know the Miami Hurricanes and you know the history behind the team, but do you really know the history behind the name? The University of Miami was shaped by a hurricane from the very start. In 1926, before classes had even begun, the city of Miami, Coral Gables, and the university were all impacted by one of the most destructive and influential hurricanes in U.S. history. By the time the Great Miami Hurricane approached South Florida in September of 26, there was very little warning by modern standards. Forecasting in the 20s relied on ship reports, barometer readings, and sparse coastal observations. There were no satellites, no radar, and of course no reconnaissance aircraft. Residents had hours, not days, to prepare. When the storm arrived, it did so with such ferocity. Winds were estimated at around 150 miles per hour, and there was a storm surge in Coconut Grove of around 15 feet. Now, this wasn't a small storm, it was very large, and the hurricane winds extended from like the Keys in the south and Port St. Lucie to the north. The storm actually made landfall in the early morning hours of September 18th, when most residents were asleep, which compounded the danger. One of the most important and tragic aspects of the 1926 hurricane was the passage of the eye directly over Miami. As the eye moved overhead, winds suddenly calmed, the rain eased, skies partially cleared. Many people believed the storm had passed. Some had left shelter. Others went outside to assess damage. Some even began the cleanup effort. What they didn't know, because hurricane science was still in its infancy and most of these people living in Miami at the time had come from somewhere else, so they didn't know what that calm was. It meant the most dangerous part was still to come in this particular case. When the backside of the eye wall arrived, winds returned just as violently, often from the opposite direction, collapsing already weakened structures and catching people completely off guard. This misunderstanding alone contributed significantly to the injuries and loss of life. In the aftermath, Miami was left devastated. Entire neighborhoods were flooded by storm surge, buildings destroyed, transportation and communications crippled for a city that was still defining itself, and for a university that hadn't quite begun yet. The storm was a complete interruption. Classes at the University of Miami were delayed because recovery needed to happen. The university didn't get to open into optimism or celebration. It opened into rebuilding. Football was part of the University of Miami almost immediately, but just like classes, the first football season did not unfold as planned. Games were delayed and rescheduled as Miami dealt with storm damage and recovery. So from the very beginning, both the university and its football program shared a defining experience. Weather wasn't theoretical, it was decisive in this case. When the football team became known as the Hurricanes, it wasn't an abstract choice. The most powerful force anyone in Miami had just experienced, the force that delayed classes, disrupted football, and reshaped the city, was, of course, a hurricane. Even though there's no single surviving document that records who officially chose the name, the context explains the decision better than the minutes ever could. Hurricanes represented raw power, unpredictability, destruction, followed by survival. In 1926 Miami, that wasn't symbolism, that was simply reality. Over time, the University of Miami's relationship with hurricanes evolved from experiences to study and to leadership. The U.S. Weather Bureau, now known as the National Weather Service, they had an office there on the Coral Gables campus, along with the National Hurricane Research Lab, which later became HRD, the Hurricane Research Division, which is out there on Virginia Key, across from the Rosenstiel School, the university's Marine and Atmospheric Science Research Hub. And of course, the key piece of it all was the National Hurricane Center. And they were right there on the Coral Gables campus as well. That wasn't accidental. Miami was simply one of the few places where hurricanes weren't just studied, they were also lived. Early hurricane forecasters like Gordon Dunn worked in Miami during a time when forecasting relied heavily on pattern recognition, experience, and memory. But this was also a time when satellites came into play. There was also radar, and the University of Miami Coral Gables campus had the first National Weather Service radar in the entire country. Later leaders like Dr. Neil Frank helped bridge the gap between observational forecasting and modern hurricane science, while also becoming trusted as a voice for the public. These forecasters worked alongside researchers and students connected to the University of Miami, helping transform hurricanes from unpredictable disasters into phenomena that could be understood, tracked, and explained. When you step back, the connections are impossible to miss. A university delayed by a hurricane, a football team named after that force, a mascot rooted in survival. The Ibis in folklore is known as the last bird to leave before the arrival of a hurricane and the first to return once it's safe afterwards. There's a scientific legacy dedicated to understanding the very storms that shaped the U. At the University of Miami, hurricanes are not just a nickname, they are history.